Hey guys, today we've got our edition of our first ever topic video. Welcome. Obviously, this is the first ever topic video I'm doing, and I'm going to talk about socialism. In the first, sort of here in the first video, socialism, communism kind of thing. So, kind of setting the standard, probably 10, 15, 20 minutes per video for this kind of stuff. So, yeah, and hopefully you enjoy these edition videos. But let's dive into this. So, socialism, obviously, we've got Karl Marx, Karl Marx kind of inventing Marxism, and then you had people like Vladimir Lenin and, others who went more extreme with it and created the ideal of communism. So socialism kind of went wild in the East. It's very popular in the East. Really started with Karl Marx. It's really hard to put it because there were other places it showed up. It was definitely very popular in London, for sure. It was very popular in England. If you didn't know that, socialism was on the rise majorly there. It was popular in Germany. It was gained popularity in France. They almost won an election in France in the 1920s, just after World War I. And yeah, you've got a couple other, but for the most part, it was the East. After World War I, really after World War I, it started to gain popularity with the establishment of Yugoslavia in 1918. And Yugoslavia was formed from Serbia, and then when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, you had Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. Joined all that. Greece had a strong socialist base too. It never really became socialist. Greece had a very popular socialist system, and Russia. Obviously, Russia. Very popular in Russia, very popular in Germany, very popular in Poland, very popular in Romania, and just Czechoslovakia. That kind of area is very popular there. It's popular in Austria. It gained traction in Italy, obviously, which led to Mussolini's kind of uprise with his fascism, which was on the other side of the scale, and that kind of led to, his rise in power. It was really just a conflict between socialists and fascists, and they decided they would want, fascism more. And so, Mussolini marches into Rome. He's greeted by a massive crowd and takes, Rome, and takes Italy under his wing. And so, we've got that. And socialism just grows and, grows in power, and it gains more and more popularity. It grows in Russia, and, downfall of the Russian Empire leads to the Soviet Union. And, after Lenin dies, really that's when you really get communism, is when Lenin shows up. And when Lenin shows up, everybody goes more extreme and goes to the very back of the spectrum. You go to communism. And, with communism, you're all in on giving, the idea of it really is a good idea. Everybody is equal, nobody is above anybody. But ultimately it became one person, one government over everybody else. And that's what communism and socialism became, even with the envisionment of, everybody's going to be equal. Everybody's going to be, safe and sound. The government is going to protect you while still being equal to you. Never going to have any power over you. That's not how it went. It just, really didn't work out like that. Like the way they thought it was going to work out. And, yeah, that just led to small revolts, but, places like the Soviet Union were exiling people to gulags. And, you didn't want to be the next person to freeze to death in the snow, And so, you have that. And, apologies. Communism grows, especially with World War II and its end, because there's so much decolonization and, conflict that had just happened that, the Soviet Union gains much influence. Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, which was already communist, and signed a peace treaty and alliance treaty with the Soviets, and the Soviets did nothing about the Germans' absorption of it. But Austria and Germany get split after World War II. And if you, when I do a World War II video, which I will do many of them, definitely more than one for sure, more than one, because it's such a broad topic. Talk about, the possibility of why Italy didn't get split, despite its, kind of surrender to the Allies. I feel like it still should have gotten the same judgment for what it was doing and fighting for. So that happened, and, they advocate for that. And, yeah. Socialism, communism, really rise after World War II, because you have decolonization and, the clouds starting to clear away, the fog of war clearing. Like I said, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia gets even stronger. Yugoslavia stays socialist, though. That's one of the things. They stay socialist instead of becoming communist and, uniting with the Soviets, which is one of the weird things about it, because they were pretty much part of the Warsaw Pact almost, but they wanted to be allies with, Russia, and they still were, but they didn't want to be that extreme, because, they were threatened by the West, and at the same time, they just didn't want to be on the very extreme of the spectrum, because they felt like socialism was less containing of the people. And, but you still had other countries. Albania, that's one I didn't mention, became communist, very strong communist country till the collapse of the Soviets. There's not really many Western societies besides Cuba that go communist. There are a lot of Western societies that change because of, that, but, that just, a lot of change there, and it's mostly happens on the eastern, hemisphere. You have Vietnam, North Korea, China, obviously, a lot of those countries coming out of, Ethiopia and Angola, all of this communism spreading on the eastern hemisphere because of decolonization, because of, strip of natural resources, and that's kind of what, happened. And it's really the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s that made everybody decide, well, it's really two things that made both systems collapse. Socialism and communism really both collapsed from two events. Socialism really collapsed from the collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 80s and 90s, because in 1987 there's a lot of civil war going on, and all the way up to 93, I believe. Then they dissolved the nation. And then when the Soviets fell in 1991 into 15 different states, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, Czechoslovakia, which dissolved in 1993, by the way, because of cultural differences between Czechs and Slovaks. And you have still remnants of communism in the Soviet Union, like Russia right now. You can kind of see that, kind of trying to link this to politics too. You see that in Vladimir Putin. I'm not even lying. That man has a goal to reunify and recreate the Soviet Union that he so loved to live in, and now he aims to destroy any country in his way, which he's losing, by the way. Not even lying, he's losing. He's really losing. But back to the point, everything collapsed. Almost every communist nation but North Korea, China, and Vietnam, and Cuba were gone, Honduras is one I didn't name. Honduras and Nicaragua were two nations that were really, getting communist influence, but, ultimately never really came to fruition. And so, pretty much all of Eastern Europe has fled from that, besides Russia and Vladimir Putin, who just can't bear to see, their empires, fall. Like, first it was the Russian Empire after World War I, and then the Soviets had a war against the Polish in the late 1910s and early 1920s, trying to reclaim that land that belonged to the Russian Empire. Failed. All of that happening because of Soviet ambition and just Russian ambition to hold on and cling to empires. And that's what Putin's doing right now. But, communism has pretty much collapsed. Socialism has pretty much become a myth. I don't think there's any more socialist countries left in the world. If there is, correct me on that. Comment and be like, these countries are socialist? Because I did not know that. But, communism, you have, I believe there's 5 countries. I can't remember the 5th one. But, you have Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and China. Mongolia was one I didn't name. Used to be communist. They fell out of communism earlier, before the Soviets did, 70s and 80s, I believe. And, that just a lot of fallout. Communism never really, because of U.S. efforts, never really gained traction in Africa either. And, with the China now clinging on to what they have left, kind of waiting to see what happens next there. But what's left of communism is not what really communism was when, the Soviets were around. Because Vietnam, their communist system is kind of turning into not so much communist system, more like the United States. I mean, they like the United States more than they do China and Russia and all of that. They made that clear in recent years. In China, their system it's always been different. It's always been a different system than what the Soviets had. And that's because of, the, dystopia that kind of spreads. And North Korea, I'd probably say, is still pretty, confidently in that communist, totalitarian, Soviet belief system still. And, not saying it didn't exist in the Middle East or there weren't ideas of it in the Middle East. It just never came to fruition in the Middle East. It's, Cuba really altered. I mean, their government has kind of, started to shift in many years towards kind of leaving that way of life. I mean, they may keep it, but, the country is so under economic crises that, with free healthcare and stuff at this point, I doubt there were really any, remaining major signs of communism there. So thank you so much for watching. Please, just, watch what I do, and I'll see you guys next time.